Without further ado, I will turn this over to Charis Heide, who's a research biologist and environmental consultant, and is currently coming to us from the Netherlands, despite being a clear Santa Barbara native and have done an amazing amount of work on monarch butterflies, monarch populations, and has been gracious enough to work with me in the past with my students. So she's done everything from data collection and research to education and community outreach. So thank you again, Charis, and take it away.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. Let's see. Okay, so are my slides going to come up? Okay, here we are. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what happened to the Western monarch butterfly. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief description to get everyone on the same page of the monarch migration through North America. So in North America, there's two general populations of the monarchs. There's the eastern monarchs, which are east of the Rocky Mountains and generally fly down to the forests in Mexico. And then the western butterflies west of the Rocky Mountains fly to the coast of California for the winter. And there is some crossover between Arizona and Mexico, but for the most part, there are these two populations, and I'm going to be talking mainly about the western population. So next slide. Okay, so monarch butterflies come to the coast of California to overwinter. They start arriving in October and have historically departed around March, although we're seeing that they are more trending to leave in January, which I will talk more about later. But from the overwintering sites, they fly north and east to breed across the West, and typically take 4 generations to expand outwards to the full extent of their breeding range. And in this figure, the Y1 through Y4 are the approximate stages of each generation in the spring migration. And each of these butterflies lives about 1 month. And then in the fall, when the milkweed starts senescing and the temperatures start to cool, these last fall generation monarchs fly south and west together to the coast of California. And these monarchs, the ones that migrate, will live up to 8 months through the winter, and then they will leave in early spring and lay eggs and start the next generation for the spring to continue the spring migration. So in a full year, there's 4 to 5 generations of monarchs. Okay, next slide. So briefly about the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count. This is a volunteer organization that started in 1997 when a group of monarch biologists noticed that the population of monarchs had started to decline, and they needed a standardized method to monitor the population. So monarch volunteers survey as many of the 400 overwintering sites in California every November and January. And our knowledge of the Western monarch population is due to the efforts of hundreds of these volunteers. And for the past several, maybe decade, I've been coordinating the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count for Santa Barbara County and training volunteers and counting a bunch of the sites together with these volunteers. So here's have from the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count, and you can see that the population fluctuates from year to year, and this is quite common for insect populations. The blue line in this graph is the number of sites that are counted each year, and then the green bars is the count of the monarch, the number of individuals that were counted. And so you can see that there's been a general decline in the numbers, and then the last 3 years here in 2018, 19, and 2020 have been the lowest that we've seen yet. So next slide. So To set the scene a little bit for what happened, there's Cheryl Schultz at the Washington State University and her colleagues published a paper in 2017 on their population viability analysis of the Western monarchs. And they estimated the quasi-extinction threshold to be about 30,000 butterflies. So this means that if the migrating population dips below this number, then theoretically there would not be enough individuals to find each other to mate once they disperse and then continue the population for the next breeding season. Next slide. So in 2018, unfortunately, we had the chance to observe this theory play out right in front of us because the Thanksgiving count yielded a total of 25,253 monarchs. So below the 30,000 threshold theory. So this was shocking because it was only 17% of monarchs from the previous year in 2017. And we could see this in the field in real time. There were sites that we counted that in 2017 had 1,000 monarchs and in 2018 had 100. So right away we knew something was going on. And then we learned that that was the trend throughout the state. And so the population in 2019 was about the same, and we got a little bit optimistic, maybe they're going to recover. But then in 2020, we saw another drastic decline with less than 2,000 individuals. So this was only 9% of the previous year in 2019 population. And so many of the sites in 2020 had zeros. And so as saddening as that is to find a zero, it's still a really important data point for volunteers to report because it's different from just a blank. It's a zero and it's important. So, and the highest count that I saw in 2020 was 50 butterflies, and that was at a site on the Gaviota Coast, which, I mean, it was just shocking in so many ways. So we know that the decline started in the spring of 2018 from data that the Xerces Society had collected. So in 2017, they had started the Western Monarch Breeding Phenology Program and monitored breeding sites throughout California. And so in the spring of 2018, they found a remarkable decline in the number of eggs and caterpillars at their sites compared to 2017. And they documented the constriction of the breeding range. And they also found that the density of the monarch eggs and larvae had a 10-fold decline between those 2 years. And then in the spring and summer of 2019, there were almost no butterflies in Oregon and Nevada, and the monarchs just didn't reach the breeding habitat in most of their western range or in the masses that they were used to. So next slide. So this means that we are left with 0.01% of the population estimated in the 1980s. And the Xerces Society created this graphic just to illustrate just how drastic this crash is. So next slide. So what is causing this decline? So there's habitat loss, habitat destruction, pesticides, herbicides have played a large part in the decline for years. But we're thinking that climate change and changing weather patterns are the main cause for this recent drastic decline. So we're experiencing warmer temperatures in fall and January, which are critical times when the monarchs use temperature cues for their migration cycle. Next slide. So warmer autumn temperatures impact monarchs as well as all other butterflies in the West. Matt Forrester's lab at the University of Nevada found that warming autumns is the main cause for the decline of a number of butterfly species, including the monarchs across the West. So warmer and drier autumns mean that the monarchs may not receive the environmental cues that they need to initiate that fall migration and trigger a diapause and migration. So they go into this diapause where they put their reproduction on hold in the fall, and that gives them the energy that they need to sustain that longer life, that shift from living 1 month to living 8 months through the winter. So warming temperatures can influence that chemical shift. And so also warmer means drier. So they may not have enough milkweed resources across the West in the drier autumns to sustain another summer or late fall generation. So these factors mean higher mortality in the fall. And so we're also seeing warming Januaries. And so when they're at their overwintering sites, a warmer January that we've seen in the last 3 years means that they are can likely breaking out of their overwintering dormancy, and we're seeing them leave the overwintering sites earlier. And so this means that where they have typically waited until March, they're now leaving in January. And that means that they're now leaving and looking for milkweed across the landscape that may not be emerging yet on the landscape. Milkweed can emerge and germinate around February or March, sometimes as late as April. So that means there's 2 or 3 months where they're not protected at their overwintering sites and they're not able to lay eggs. And compound that with the more frequent and extreme spring storms that we're getting means that they're not protected and there's a higher mortality in the spring. And that they're susceptible to freezing temperatures in the spring freezes and inland when they're away from the coast. So compound all these factors together and you end up with the lowest migrating numbers we've ever seen. So next slide. So what does this all mean? It means that we'll likely lose our migrating population in the West. And the monarchs' range is then constricted to resident populations in temperate areas of California. And so the impacts of the loss of migration means that there's very few monarchs outside of California where the temperatures dip below freezing. Okay, next slide. So where do monarchs fit in the community? So interestingly enough, monarchs make very poor pollinators. They're so efficient with their long legs and their long proboscis that they just don't pick up the pollen the way a bee does. So they're not great pollinators, but they are a great food source for a great many birds and insects and invertebrates. So this means that less than 1% of eggs reach adulthood, which means there's a high rate of predation. And so a study recently reported video surveillance of 10 taxa of nocturnal arthropods prey on monarch eggs and larvae. So in the food web, the decline of a prey species can lead to a cascading effect up the food web and a decline in the predator species. So moving on, next slide. So what can we do for the monarchs? First of all, if it's climate related, then we can reduce our carbon and stop climate change, right? That's easy enough. No, okay, that's big. But moving on, what we can do in our gardens, next slide, is, okay, so beyond this, the Xerces Society has pulled together the Western Monarch Call to Action, which are a list of actions and where those actions can be applied in California. So number one, we have protect and manage overwintering sites. So this is big because currently in California, there is no consistent protection for overwintering sites. So we can advocate at local, regional, and state levels to ensure that these sites are legally protected. We are still seeing the destruction of overwintering habitats and for development, and then also the recent droughts that we've had have destroyed most of the trees, and we see trees still dying at overwintering sites. And so these sites are sensitive because cutting one tree or one tree falling or even trimming a few branches can change the microclimate enough for the monarchs to find them less suitable. So increasing the amount of habitat management plans that we have for these overwintering sites would help. And also an interesting factor about this is until now, until this decline, we've used the presence of monarchs at overwintering sites to define overwintering habitat. So that means that protecting these sites will become more challenging without the presence of monarchs to prove that these sites are important, or even to prove that it is a site or it was a site. So our historical records are going to become much more valuable, but it'll mean that it's just going to become more harder to define new overwintering habitat and protect that. 2, next slide. So 2, we can restore breeding and migratory habitat in California. So this means in your gardens, if you're along the coast, you can plant winter flowering plants where the monarchs are during the winter, and then away from the coast, you can plant summer flowering nectar species to support their migration. And it also means planting milkweed, and specifically native milkweed. So planting native milkweed in the right place is going to be key. The Xerces Society has recommended to plant native milkweed 5 miles away from the coast, away from overwintering sites. But they've since adjusted this to 1 mile away from overwintering sites. And the discussion around where to plant milkweed and native milkweed is linked to a protozoan parasite called OE. It has a much longer scientific name, but we've shortened it to OE. So this parasite weakens or kills monarchs, and it passes from the female to the egg. And it can persist on tropical milkweed plants that don't lose their leaves over the winter and don't go into a dormancy. And so native milkweed plants go into a natural dormancy. So we're promoting native milkweed to help stop the spread of this protozoan parasite. And there's a lot of research about this on the eastern population. So I'll talk about what's going on in the eastern population. So over the summer, the percentage of infected individuals grows quickly as the population expands through the breeding range. Then in the fall, during the migration south to Mexico, the weak individuals, or the infected individuals, are mostly too weak to make the trip. So the population arriving in Mexico has a relatively low infection rate. And this is called migratory culling, where it's the process of clearing the infection by migration. So then the cycle in the spring begins again with a relatively healthy population. So applying this concept to the Western population is a bit tricky if breeding populations and our breeding habitat is in the same place as overwintering habitat, and we also don't have enough data or research to really understand how migratory culling occurs in the Western population. But we know that if there's no migratory culling, that the OE infection can spread rapidly through the population. And we know this from the resident population in Florida, that the non-migratory population can have a really high infection rate. Okay, so essentially, we don't want fields of milkweed close to overwintering sites, but I think a few milkweed plants in your Santa Barbara garden or in your school is just fine, because I think that personal connection to the milkweed and the monarchs and the eggs and the caterpillars, and watching that process, is important for us to connect to it, for our kids to see, for education. So I wouldn't discourage that. I would just limit it to a few plants right along the coast where the monarch overwintering sites are, and then expanding breeding and milkweed growth away from the coast. But we also think that milkweed is not the limiting factor for the monarch decline. It's more climate related. Okay, 3, protect monarchs in their habitat, protects monarchs and their habitat from pesticides. So often large nurseries will treat their plants, and especially their milkweed, with pesticides. So from organic nurseries, or grow nectar and milkweed plants from organic seed. Also advocate to limit the use of pesticides and herbicides, and buy organic and support local organic farms and school gardens and everything that this program's about. Okay, 4, protect, manage, and restore breeding, summer breeding, and fall migration monarch habitat outside of California. That's very similar. We'll move on. Number 5, answer key research questions about how best to aid the Western monarch recovery. So this is something very tangible that you guys can participate in right now. There's the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge. And this is where, if you see a monarch, you take a picture, even if it's a blurry picture, and you post it to their website and their email. Just Google Western Monarch Mystery Challenge. And this helps to fill an interesting data gap where we're trying to figure out where monarchs go when they leave overwintering sites. Where are they in that early spring period? So it's happening right now. And then you can win prizes, and it's very exciting. Okay. Moving on, next slide. Okay, so what can we do in our gardens? Well, this is a garden program, so there's so many resources about what you can do in your gardens. This is just one resource, 100 plants to save the monarchs. And then there's a sign that you can use to post that you have habitat and to protect it from pesticides and to label it as important. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is heavy stuff, but I think there are still reasons for hope. I think we can find hope in evolutionary biology. Monarchs are a highly mobile, highly adaptable species. So maybe I wonder if these individuals that are left in the migratory population somehow, hopefully, have the right genetic variability to become more resilient and more resistant to the environmental changes and the increasing extreme temperatures that we're seeing. Maybe they'll be able to build a stronger, more resilient population in the West moving forward. We are also seeing that there's signs of increased breeding in Arizona and Utah this spring. And this means that the Western population could be influenced by monarchs coming from Mexico and from the Eastern population. So we could see an influx to the West from the more robust Eastern population. And we still have so much more to learn. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charis. sometimes we go, yay, this is amazing. And then other times we go, oh, we got to hang our head in shame because this is a devastating
And
result.
cry.
And it's, yeah, I think, Charis and I have been kind of joking around that a lot of biologists need a support group when they're sitting around and watching their study species go into such a drastic decline. And just since I've been here in 2004, I remember early on, we counted as many as 50,000 monarchs just at the Elwood, Maine congregation site. And now to see, just a couple thousand in the entire Western population really is devastating. So I will put out some questions, and some of you've already addressed, but there is a general question, again, for those of us on the coast, that planting of the milkweed. And just to kind of re-summarize that, your suggestion is we don't have to not plant some native milkweed, but maybe we stop short of planting massive amounts of it. And, the key being focusing on the native milkweed rather than the non-native tropical milkweeds that maintain their leaves throughout the entire year. Has there been any work or any discussion about local genotypes? So the idea being not only having the native species, but also potentially, has there been any thought or effect of local genotypes that are adapted to a particular region?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of push to promote the Asclepias californica, which is one of the early emerging milkweed species. It's one of the first to emerge, and as I talked about, that if monarchs are leaving earlier in January, they're going to start needing milkweed earlier and earlier. But from what I understand from the Xerces Society, finding local genotypes of Asclepias californica is rare. It's hard to find. So they're working on making this species more readily commercially available, and also pay very close attention to local genotypes, that where the seed came from and where it came from. So I know there's work on that. Yes.
And so there's been also a couple questions about providing links for some of this information. So I just want to let everybody know that we may not be able to like track it down right now in real time and put it in the chat, but we will get those links. We'll put them on a document that you can access through the website. And one thing I will also
Western Monarch Count.org is a really good resource for the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count. All the data is there. They have resources there. And then that links back to the Xerces Society website with that book that you can find in their store. So,
yeah. And so as people are planning, like let's say you're planting a garden, you want to do this the right way, would you still suggest that maybe if you're right on the coastline, like a lot of us in Santa Barbara and some others that are joining us, to focus a bit more on the nectar producing plants for us that would be more of a food source for the monarch as butterfly, as opposed to breeding habitat for the caterpillars?
Yes, and specifically winter flowering native plants, or not even native, but winter flowering is going to make that nectar available when the monarchs are wintering, and then a little bit farther away from the overwintering sites start promoting more native milkweed. But as I said, the having a few milkweed plants in your garden, I think, is good just for that human connection, because we can't lose that.
Mm-hmm. And some have asked that, if you do, for example, have tropical milkweed, is it just better to then kind of just cut it back during the winter so that it can't be used, or it wouldn't allow for the increase in the parasite population?
Yes, yeah. Cutting it back around in November and then letting it regrow in January would be ideal, especially because you cut it back, you get rid of those leaves that could have the OE from the previous season. And also if you're curious, if the monarchs in your yard have OE, you can, I think it's monarchhealth.org, but I'll find that too, because you can Google Monarch Health and you get an insurance company sometimes. So, but monarchhealth.org is the University of Georgia, and you can request a sample kit, and they'll send you this kit where if the milkweed or if the monarch hatches out or emerges from the chrysalis and you can grab it, then you can very efficiently and without harming the butterfly collect a little sample and then send that back to them, and they'll look at it under a microscope and tell you if your butterflies are infected. And that's just something for you to know. I think it's important.
Have you heard of the Mayor's Monarchs Pledge? So this is primarily going towards Charis. And if so, from the list of options to support monarch populations, which do you think are the most beneficial? So I don't know if you've seen that. I haven't. I don't know if you've seen the Mayor's Monarchs Pledge. Sorry, tripping over that name. If there's anything you can say about that.
Yeah, I have heard of it. I haven't looked into it deeply, but I do know that it was created and intended more for the Eastern population, and it's more heavily geared towards planting natives and the issues for the Eastern population. So translating it directly over to the Western population might be a little tricky because of the planting milkweed in specific places isn't across the board like universal as it is in the East. But from what I understand, it can be adjusted, and there's certain goals that the mayors can commit to specifically toward their area, and it just needs a bit more fine tuning. But I think it's a good idea. It's a great way to get cities more engaged in the issue.
Okay. And so that question I posed to you, and again, just thinking what might be coming down the road is, would anybody or has anybody discussed any possibilities, or is it even possible to reintroduce monarchs to the Western population? We've done, in extreme situations where we've done captive breeding and reintroduction, the California condor, the bald eagle, especially after they've had significant declines that are, human caused, whether it be DDT or lead shot or habitat loss. Given that we're seeing such a drastic decline in the Western monarch population, is that being discussed at all? That are we in a situation where we may have to try to figure out a way to captively breed and reintroduce them? Can you do that and still have migrating monarchs?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at this point in the circles in the discussions I've had, there's a whole lot of wild ideas being thrown around of like, what can we do? I don't know the crazy ideas is, can we go to Mexico and collect mated females and bring them back and like put them in milkweed fields that we know, and can we, monitor that and like seed the population back with Mexican or monarchs from Mexico? That idea is interesting and I think has weight, and while the two Eastern and Western populations are genetically similar, there still are some physiological differences between the two populations. The monarchs that go down to Mexico, they have to fly a much longer distance in their migration, and so their wings are actually larger than the Western monarchs. So, I mean, that's an idea. There's also an idea of artificially triggering the monarchs to go into their winter diapause and like trigger that migration. Can we collect the monarchs and put them in and like cool them down so they get that cool temperature stimulus and then release them? I mean, there's just some wild ideas right now, and I think we are all grasping at the wild ideas to figure out nothing. I don't know what will come to fruition at this point, but I think we need crazy ideas on the table. So
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
So another question came through that says, what are the main predators of monarch caterpillars? Are these caterpillars toxic to birds? The observation was that they had 40 caterpillars one week at different stages of age. Next week, all gone. You know, what happens? And I've seen that as well. You know, we find milkweed, a ton of caterpillars. You think, oh, this is great. You come back and wait, they're gone. What happened to them? If they're supposed to have sequestered this cardiac glycoside that helps protect them against predators, is it still predators out doing that and still consuming them? Or is there some other reason why they're no longer on the plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have seen wasps come and systematically pick the caterpillars off the plant and take the caterpillars back to their babies. And some of this is natural. Like I was saying, there's an extremely high predation rate in monarchs, and that's why a monarch female can lay 400 eggs, is because most of them are going to get eaten, and that's kind of an important part of the life cycle. But if all of your okay, so one thing is wasps are a big predator in the Santa Barbara area, so you could put up wasp. Well, I don't know, Denise, what you're going to think about that, but
see, now you're seeing the competition between which group are you trying to favor? Yeah,
I know which one. What do you want? You could, if you want to protect your caterpillars on your plant, you could put a net over them to keep the airborne predators off. But then there's also like earwigs will climb up and eat the eggs, and like crickets and a whole bunch of other, well, maybe not crickets, but from that, anyway, Google video surveillance of nocturnal predators, and it lists a whole bunch. Also, the taconid fly, the red-eyed fly, can lay an egg on the caterpillar, and then that egg will start eating the caterpillar, and then the caterpillar will form its chrysalis, and then it will turn black, and instead of a butterfly coming out, you get these little strands of the fly maggots crawling out, which is if you're expecting a butterfly and a maggot comes out,
it's just what a letdown.
Right, but that's also a natural process.
Yep, exactly.
And then also sometimes if your milkweed, or if the female was infected with OE, what can happen is you could see caterpillars that just look weak and then like fall off the plant, and they just die, and that can happen too.
Yeah, and then the kind of the last thing just to keep in mind too, if you see like really big caterpillars and then they're gone, they may have actually crawled off and found another spot to actually form the chrysalis. So they don't necessarily form the chrysalis on the milkweed. They may actually be finding a protected area away from the milkweed to form the chrysalis. So that's something too we found.
Absolutely, and that could be as much as like 30 feet away. They go on this walkabout, and they will go find the perfect place for them to. And in my yard, they loved the top bar of the fence, the cross beam. And so it was just like chrysalis, right along there. I love that. So yeah, so if they're big, if they're the 5th instar caterpillar, then and they leave, let them leave. That's actually what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you're seeing here too is we start to see these dramatic declines. We're going to run into this very challenging set of questions about, do we kind of decrease the populations of one native species in order to support the population of another native species? And sadly, that does sometimes put us in a conflict. And we see that all the time in conservation biology, whether you're looking, especially when you're looking at predators and the things they consume. And it's not a place we want to be, which is why we want to try to promote the healthy populations of all these, so we don't have to make those choices. So back to some of the questions here. It says, if we have a small area to follow up to that with the monarch one, asking whether besides wasps and some other things, are there birds that may also be consuming the caterpillars?
Yes, absolutely. I have seen Western kingbirds sit by the monarch cluster and just pick the monarchs off the cluster. And this one time I was counting monarchs out at Elwood, and I found a little cluster. It was in 1990, no, sorry, not 90. 2019. So the population was already small. So I found this little cluster of 10 monarchs and at Elwood, and then a Western kingbird came and ate one, and I was like, 9. Now there's 9.
There's 9. Yeah, yeah. I think
Aww.
one of the
So
fascinating things about this whole thing is this arms race between the plant, the monarch, and then the predator, the monarch. So you have the milkweed producing a secondary metabolite, a compound that's toxic, these cardiac glycosides that help defend it against insect herbivores. But then, of course, one of the things that the monarch was able to do was to evolve resistance to that compound. And the fascinating way they did that was to sequester it into its own body tissue as a full compound, making the monarch itself toxic to its predators. You know, it's basically an emetic. If a bird bites, gets a good chunk of a monarch, it'll throw up because it's kind of toxic stuff. But then, of course, the predators of the monarch have evolved ways either to resist the cardiac glycoside, and I've seen some evidence associated with some of the enzymes, physiological enzymes that are associated with the impact of that compound, but also behavioral changes, like they will separate out the different parts of the butterfly or the caterpillar and eat the ones that have the lowest level of the toxin. So it's just a constant back and forth. And at the same time, we're focusing right now on the monarchs and how can we preserve them. But if you step back and you just look at the overall interaction of the species and the ecology, it's really a fascinating story you're watching play out with the monarchs laying their eggs on the milkweed and then moving through that. One thing I found.
One more.
Go. Yeah, sorry, Charis, go.
Oh, yeah. One more thing about the predators. So there's birds. There's in Mexico, there's a grosbeak that is a pernicious predator of the monarchs. Also, you get small rodents eating monarchs at overwintering sites. So after a storm comes through, it can knock the monarchs onto the ground, and then the mice and rats will eat the monarchs that are on the ground if they haven't had a chance to crawl back up. Most of the time, there's the trees, and then if there's plants underneath that they can crawl back up off the ground and then be protected. But if they can't, or if the mice get them first, then you can get to the monarch site in the morning and just see a pile of just the wings, because the mice will just eat the abdomen of the monarch. And then
And I think there's evidence the populations of rodents actually migrate up into the forests when the monarchs arrive. Like they know this massive food resource is arriving, and they actually move in to feed on it. There was some work done too that some of the adult monarch butterflies might actually choose milkweed plants of higher cardiac glycoside levels if they have, I think if it's associated with something, if they have a high level of parasite load, in order to try to benefit their caterpillars. I don't know if you've seen anything about that.
I haven't, but that's really interesting. I've also wondered if different species of milkweed have different levels.
Yeah, and that they have shown even like within, so that, but apparently it looks like the adult butterflies are able to sense somehow, and I don't think they necessarily know the mechanism, the level of the toxicity in the plant, and may actually choose plants of higher levels for some of their to lay their eggs, to benefit their caterpillars potentially, as a way also to fend off some of the parasite.
That's fascinating.
So, I mean, and this is the other thing that I think hopefully everyone's getting from this, is just how much we still don't know. A question I've always asked Charis is like, do we really know how these butterflies get back to the very same locations each year for these congregation sites, and do we have enough, a question for you with regard to the overall health, and it's kind of related to this, is do we know much about the genetic diversity of these populations? Clearly, we're going through a massive bottleneck right now with the Western monarch population. If it were to recover and increase again in population size, it's going to be coming from a relatively small population now that has relatively low genetic diversity. I think, but do we know? Like, do we have any good data on the genetic diversity of these populations?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't think I'm the right person to ask about the genetic diversity, but I am constantly amazed that from year to year, these monarchs find the exact same branch that they used the year before, with having it be 5 generations removed. And
Mhm.
then I've also often gotten the question, well, is it the direct descendant at this site?
Mhm.
And finding that one branch, is there some kind of memory there? And I don't think so, because we know there is a really high rate of movement between overwintering sites, and they are constantly shifting. Is it drier at this site? Is there too much wind? Oh, I'm going to go over here. This one's more protected. This one's moister. I don't have to leave to find resources. I can stay. And oh, this one got a little too cold, so I'm going to go over here. And so we know there's incredible amount of movement. So I don't know that it's like the direct descendant coming to that one spot, but my goodness, that's an incredible area where we could do a lot more research.
Yeah, and I think in general, there's still a fair bit to try to understand about how they orient. Um, both a
Yeah.
combination of potential kind of magnetism, Earth
Hmm.
magnetic fields, but also things like where the sun is oriented and located as they're moving. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think too, what there was a request to get your email into the chat somewhere so that people can contact you. So if you drop that in the chat, I think Rachel can put it out for everybody. Um, so another question here is it possible that Western Monarch have moved their overwintering location due to climate change? Are researchers just checking the historic overwintering sites, or are they tracking monarchs to find potential new overwintering sites?
Excellent question. And yes. So that first year of the decline, 2018, that was our number one question. Is we saw we were monitoring all of the historic ones, and every year we find new ones. Maybe we get a report of some private land that we haven't had access to, and oh my goodness, now they have monarchs, and let's go count there. So we do get new overwintering sites every year. But historically, we always go back to the historic ones. And so 2018, we're like, well, are they just finding, like, all of a sudden finding somewhere else to go? And what is happening, because they were so few? And so we looked, and we would look in canyons and look in other groves of trees, and they weren't there. And so then we realized, well, they're just not anywhere. They're just really low numbers. But uh, Francis Villablanca at Cal Poly, a professor who's taking over the monarch study there, he and his students did a maxent analysis of the climate and topography and all these other environmental factors to see to find suitable habitat. So they put in the suitable habitat that we know of, and then did a range, and then and it came back pretty similar to what we knew. And then they did it with a climate change model. So they predicted out 20 or 30 years, and they found that the suitable habitat will move north and higher elevation going forward. So then the next question is, well, if they are going to move higher in the elevation as it gets warmer and drier in the south, I think we're going to see a range constriction in their overwintering range. I think, like, 20 years ago, there used to be overwintering and clustering monarchs in San Diego and Baja, and now we're seeing much lower numbers there, even though, and like Monterey and Pacific Grove are seeing higher numbers, or we're still seeing numbers. So I think the overwintering range will maybe constrict, and then if there's suitable habitat, it will move up into higher elevations. Kind of similar to how the monarchs cluster in the mountaintops in Mexico, in the Michoacan mountain range. They're on these mountaintops. So maybe that's what the Western monarchs will emulate then.
So I have a question.
But we are looking at all these places. We're trying. So
searching. So everyone's continuing.
So we're searching
and hopefully getting lucky. Like one day.
And so the Monarch Mystery Challenge and all these other groups are trying to reach out to hiking groups and birding groups, saying, hey, if you just happen to see monarchs in a large group of monarchs in January, let us know, because that's incredibly interesting. Because monarchs are so rare right now in California, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has suspended their any tagging program and handling of monarchs. And so just to prevent any further harm coming from the monarchs so that's just something to keep aware of if you're active with monarchs in your yard. Also, if you are handling them, like bringing them inside, maybe don't, but then also make sure that your equipment is really sterile, so you're not transporting OE or any other pathogens and doing more harm than good. And then I loved what Denise said, is get involved in citizen science. And so the first one that comes to mind is, well, the Monarch Mystery Challenge. Help us understand where the monarchs are and when. And then Monarch Alert at Cal Poly has a garden survey that you can participate in to tell them what species of milkweed do you have. And then there's a monarch larval monitoring program, MLMP, that has you go out weekly and count the caterpillars and the eggs and the different instars that you have, and then so that we can track what's happening where. So there's so much to do and get involved in.
Great.
Thank you for your interest.